this was a foundational experience that I had that made me think that, these psychedelic experiences were valuable, not only short term, but long term. I was in college and I did mushrooms, and I was having this, I was clearly, tripping. And I started thinking about all these things I was anxious about in my life. And they began to sort of feel like a physical weight on me. Like I just kept going through this loop in my mind where I'd be worried about this. And, I realized, they were really dominating me and making me feel terrible much of the time. And then I suddenly visualized them all as like I was like this boulder weighing me down. And then I suddenly realized
my returning guest today is Tom Shroder, and he's back this time to talk about his book, Acid Test. Acid Test, How a Daring Group of Psychonauts Rediscovered the Power of LSD, MDMA, and other psychedelic drugs to heal addiction, depression, anxiety, and trauma. So, Tom, welcome back. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, glad to be back. Thank you, Laurie.
So glad. So, I personally read your book. I've had a huge interest in psychedelics since I had my first journey with San Pedro several years ago. I have since had 16 journeys with 5-MeO-DMT, and I have called them life-changing for me. So I'm curious, how in the world did you decide, from a journalist who's also written the book that we've talked about in an interview we did called Old Souls, which I will put the video of Tom and my interview from that about reincarnation, to psychedelics?
Well, this was something that really had roots to, when I was 19 years old. I, like a lot of college students in the 70s, I experimented with psychedelics, and I found the experience to be really valuable. I mean, it wasn't something that I took lightly. I felt like I learned a lot about myself and about the world by my experiences, with peyote and mushrooms and LSD, amongst some other lesser known things. And, and not only that, I mean, it has a couple of roots to it. The other thing is that because of my interest in psychedelics, I was a student journalist at the University of Florida. And when I was editor of the college paper, I lived in Sarasota, Florida, and I made a trip home for a break. And I noticed that the local paper had this article about this hippie who is like building this amazing house in the woods east of the coast. And something about the article made me think that this guy had some interesting ideas. And his name was Rick Doblin. So I went out and I found this house. I decided I was going to do an article on him for the college paper. And I found this house, and there's this guy, long-haired guy, bare-chested, working outside his house with his pet wolf on a chain outside the house.
Wow.
Everything about it seemed really cool to me. And the house was amazing. I mean, it was this big cedar house. He had commissioned this giant stained glass window, of some kind of theme of enlightenment or something, obviously, that was in the house. I mean, it had all this beautiful work and woodwork and river stone floors and timbers. And, it was just an amazing house. And so I interviewed him, and sort of between the lines, he was talking about self-discovery. And it was clear that what he was really talking about was the sort of insights that you gain from psychedelic experiences. And so I wrote this story. I thought, I just thought, this is a really cool guy. I love the wolf, love the house. So I wrote this story. And then 10 years go by, and I am the editor of the Miami Herald Sunday magazine. And I read a story in the Tampa paper about this guy who's crusading for psychedelics to become a therapy drug. And I look at the picture, and it's the same guy. It's this Rick Doblin guy that I had spent that day with 10 years earlier.
Wow.
So I assigned one of my reporters to do a story on, we call them like the Tim Leary of the 80s. And, yes. and we put him on the cover of the magazine. Really interesting story. The reporter ended up doing Ecstasy with him and sort of reporting on that experience. And then another, let's see, how many more years go by? Another, I would almost 15 years go by, after 15 to 20 years go by. And at this point, I am the editor of the Washington Post magazine, Sunday magazine. And I see a story in the New York Times about Harvard is doing the first psychedelic research project that it's ever done since they kicked Tim Leary out. And then I'm reading down, and it's the whole thing is the brainchild and supported by this organization called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS. And the founder and CEO of that organization is Rick Doblin. So I said, this is too much. I said, this time I'm going to do this story. So I called up, I called him up, and I said, you probably don't remember me. And he says, not only do I remember you, but I was just today presenting to my board of directors the magazine cover you did when you were at the Miami Herald on me, just to show how, here there was this sort of wild hippie on the magazine cover, and now, I'm doing this Harvard study and everything, and, how respectable I've come.
Tom, do you believe in synchronicities?
Yeah. So I thought, well, so I decided I would do a story on this. And I mean, one thing was amazing. He wasn't quite as, he hadn't really changed at all. He says, see how respectable I've come. Well, it ended up that there was a new president at Harvard who said, I don't want anything to do with this crazy guy, Doblin. And they stopped the study at that point. But what it turned out was that Rick had this incredible journey beginning when he was a student at New College in Sarasota. And he was sort of this, he didn't drink, he didn't even drink coffee. And he was this very intellectually curious guy. And, he was from a Jewish family who had relatives who had died in the Holocaust. And, and basically he grew up sort of thinking, how can we as human beings do this to each other? This kind of crazy stuff. And, he had this visionary dream of sort of growing up and doing something to sort of heal the world of this homicidal mania that we seem to be in the grips of. And then, so when he was in New College, he started, everybody on campus was doing LSD and having these all-night parties and everything. And he did LSD, and he had this experience of, kind of an opening and seeing the world in a different way. And he began to think that this is what the world needs. The world needs to see the world as people see it in this psychedelic experience, to realize the beauty, the innate beauty of everything, how everything's connected, you know, how all our hatred is just this, you know, rooted in sort of ignorance and personal pain. And, you know, he thinks, hey, you know, this could save the world. And what he discovered is that, you know, then he went, he was in college about the same time I was. So it was in the, you know, late 60s, early 70s. And he discovered that for 20 years, psychedelics, LSD in particular, but other psychedelics as well, had been the most studied psychiatric drug in history. And that not only that, but there were thousands and thousands of people who had used psychedelics and gotten in therapeutic and clinical settings. And they'd had amazing results, successful results. So that, you know, around the late 50s and early 60s, people were proclaiming complete revolution in psychiatry based on these psychedelic drugs. And this was a thriving thing until the late 60s when, you know, ironically, like the CIA started wanting to study psychedelics to use as some kind of coercive interrogation device or something.
Like a truth serum is what they were after.
Yeah, well, it was contradictory because in some cases they were saying, oh, we could give it to, you know, to enemy agents and make them tell the truth. Or they said, or we could give it to our own agents and make it impossible for them to tell the truth when they were under interrogation. You know, or we could give it to foreign leaders and discredit them by having them act bizarrely. You know, they had all these weird stuff. And basically their interest in this came from experiments that the Nazis had done with mescaline. You know, really sort of using it along with physical torture, if you can imagine what a nightmare that would be. And so, you know, taking a page out, you know, after the war, when they got a hold of all the Nazi research, the CIA decided they wanted to do their own research. And because they did this in a really underhanded and horribly unethical manner, which is, for instance, they had things like they would stand up a brothel in San Francisco and give the LSD to unsuspecting Johns just to sort of observe them, or they would give it to their own agents without their knowledge, you know, and creating some really terrible repercussions from that. But also they were funding all these university studies that were very loosely supervised and not well controlled. And so all these students on college campuses were like volunteering for these studies that were basically funded by the CIA. And as a result of their experience, they had the same kind of reaction that I had, which was, you know, this isn't just like a party drug. This is something that I'm getting tremendous insights from.
Yeah.
And so they started figuring out how to make LSD themselves and started distributing it to all their friends and having these, you know, wild acid test parties with, you know, like the Grateful Dead was playing and the Merry Pranksters with Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was one of those people who volunteered for a CIA-funded study, and that's how he sort of got turned on to LSD. And so all these drugs proliferated on campuses across the country. And at the same time as there was this anti-war movement among and sort of countercultural movement among college-age people. And so the powers that be started to, you know, get really freaked out about this bizarre drug that was making people sort of anti-American and anti-war, and and sort of and then Tim Leary sort of added to all this by when he started giving it to his students on Harvard's campus, and then he sort of went beyond that and started becoming this guru of the psychedelic movement, and saying, tune in, turn on, and drop out. And so, the authorities were facing what they thought was this wholesale disruption of their society, by these people doing this drug. So they really decided to crack down on it. And so they made it a Schedule I drug, which was in the same list as heroin, saying that it was completely illegal even to study. And so, of course, what they managed to do was this most studied psychiatric drug in history suddenly went from that to nothing. Nobody was studying it. If anybody, any academic said that it's, even proposed doing a study, their career could be ruined. So it became, and of course, it didn't stop popular use of it. It didn't stop illegal use of the drug. It just stopped scientific use of it. So all this tremendous progress that had been made in using it as a therapy drug just completely ground to a halt. And it was just at that time when Rick Doblin said, I want to be a psychedelic therapist. And just at the time that they were shutting it all down. So basically, he decided, and he didn't, at the time, he hadn't even graduated from college yet. He kind of dropped out to do this. And he began this journey. He ended up getting a PhD in public policy from the Kennedy School. But, at this time, he was just completely on his own. But there were there was this network of people around Esalen in California who had been using these drugs for therapy with great success for years. And they kind of went underground. And he connected with them and said, this shouldn't just be an underground drug. We need to demonstrate to the world that this is safe and successful in treating all sorts of really terrible psychiatric issues.
And explain what Echelon is for the people that don't know it.
Well, it was an institute for, basically the exploration and study of the connection between the spiritual and material world. I would say it was not a bad description of it. A lot of free thinking people, a lot of people who were really smart and really credentialed, and they had lectures, they had sessions for group sessions and things like that. And so he kind of inserted himself into this community of really accomplished, experienced people, and this college dropout.
Right.
But he just had this unquenchable vision that just kept driving him, and so then a quirk of science was that these new psychedelic drugs were being created in the lab, and so MDMA was one of them, which is also known as ecstasy, and they weren't illegal because they hadn't existed. So there was a loophole in that these new psychedelic drugs, they could use them. So he started, proselytizing, and plus MDMA had some advantages over LSD as a therapeutic drug, because LSD is such a big and encompassing experience that it's with a sympathetic person, experienced person along with you, if you start going down a rabbit hole, they can kind of help you work through it. And people have difficult moments in psychedelic trips sometimes because they're coming up against some of the pain that they've carried around with them for a long time. And so if you have someone with you in a safe, sort of secure setting, comfortable setting, and they're telling you, just don't run from this. Just, this will pass. Just experience it, and feel it. And, what can it tell you? If someone is doing that kind of thing, these difficult moments end up being breakthrough moments. But if someone starts saying, "Oh my God, maybe we need to get you to the emergency room," and feeds the paranoia, then it can turn into a really bad experience,
Right.
like a bad trip. But MDMA has these properties of, making people feel safe and protected when they're taking it, so that they can look at these traumatic memories or experiences that they've been scared to explore. And basically, when you have what causes PTSD is that you have this really horrendous experience, and that your mind and body are so afraid of it that they metaphorically, it's like a fire alarm is going off in the basement, and it's constantly going off, keeping you on edge, but you're completely terrified to go down to that basement to, see what's going on and maybe shut it off. And so instead, you're guarding the basement and keeping anybody who gets close to it, you're reacting with this aggressive response to keep them away from this thing. So what MDMA has this property where it sort of relaxes that hypervigilance. So it allows you to look at these traumatic memories with a kind of calm distance, and to see them for what they are rather than for what you fear they are. What happens is that people will have these horrible experiences, and that they're so afraid of them that they sort of become monstrous beyond even what they really are. And if you can look at them calmly and clearly, and not only that, so it does that, it also enhances memories. You can have very sort of go back to distant memories, and suddenly it's like you're there. And thirdly, is it promotes this sense of connection with people who are, near you. And of course, in therapy, one of the biggest keys to success is a connection with your therapist, a positive, healthy connection with your therapist. So all three of these things, the enhanced memory, the relaxed vigilance, hypervigilance, and the feeling of connectedness are like the, triumvirate of perfect keys to having good therapeutic results. So, when Rick realized that, he was a big proponent of the LSD experience, but he realized that this MDMA experience might even be better for therapy. And plus, it was still legal for a while. And so he started, and that was the period of time when I did that magazine story on him in Miami. And then the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, sort of got wise to it, and they made a ruling that MDA and other new novel psychedelics would be just as illegal as LSD and the other ones, so shutting it down. And so Rick went to this informal group in California and said, we shouldn't just take this sitting down. We have evidence from all these years of therapy. One of the requirements for a Schedule I drug, to schedule a drug is on the Schedule I, is that it can't have any any kind of accepted medical purpose. And there are all these doctors and psychiatrists who said, hey, we've been using this for years and it works.
Yeah.
So,
Can I read some quotes from your book
sure,
where
sure.
you talk about some of these different
Yeah,
psychedelics that were studied? Because I find this super fascinating. So I'm in no way saying, hey, go run out and try an illegal substance. But there is so much clinical data now that these substances have hugely beneficial, as you've been describing, abilities to change people's lives. And so I'm going to take a few different quotes out of your book. So this is one about LSD. And they said that one of the two hardcore reductivist alcoholics quit drinking on the spot after a single therapy session with LSD and remained sober throughout the 6-month follow-up. So there was definitely some evidence that LSD was helping people clinically to get over different types of addictions, alcohol, drug, really powerful addictions that are very difficult to overcome cold turkey, which I thought was fascinating. You had another quote in here, and this was related to a lady who had chronic PTSD. And she said, I had chronic PTSD and I tried lots of different things, and my life was really difficult. And MDMA really turned it around and saved my life. That's what's important. And then Nick, who is a veteran who served in the Iraqi war, he had a quote about MDMA after he was able to go through 2 different cycles of treatment. And he said, after using it, I could go into a meditation and I felt like I had MDMA in my system without using it at all. So obviously there's not an addiction to it. He's not continuing to want to use it. He's able to figure out how to use it and then use the benefits of what he learned from those sessions to then control his PTSD and his anxiety as that would come up. I thought it was really interesting. You had a little segment in here about peyote. So peyote is a mescaline, for those of you who don't know, which is a psychedelic, and it's been used throughout the Indian tribes and communities for centuries. And there is a members of the Native American church that this person in here was studying with them. He had embedded himself in their culture and studied them, and he talked to members who had used peyote greater than 100 times. And they said they were physically healthy and performed as well on cognitive tests as matched controls who had never taken peyote. And many believe that their peyote use had cured them of alcoholism. And then I'll share one more. And this is around psilocybin, which is also referred to as magic mushrooms. You personally have used psilocybin and understand the tremendous transformative experiences you have in this state, the insights that you have. And what the people in these clinical trials said was, this was the most important experience of my life. This was the most important experience I've ever had in my life. And the data showed that part of them experience an increase in self-confidence, a greater sense of inner contentment, a better ability to tolerate frustration, decreased nervousness, and increased overall well-being. So there definitely is a lot of evidence now, I think, that supports that these psychedelics have healing abilities that sometimes people who have tried everything that they can possibly try and thought that they were stuck with being on antidepressants that didn't address the symptoms, treated the issues without addressing the core of what was causing it.
Right. And in fact, I mean, they've gone through with MDMA for PTSD. They've gone through 3 phases of clinical trials, and they're in the 3rd phases where hundreds of people are undergoing this treatment, and they're carefully grading how successful it is and also how safe it is.
Right.
And it is on the verge of being approved for use. I'd say in the next 2 years, you'll be able to get a doctor, a psychiatrist, to refer you to a clinic where you can undergo this MDMA therapy.
For PTSD, right, Tom? Specifically PTSD?
Yes, but they'll also be able to prescribe it off label for other things like
Sure.
addiction issues,
Depression, anxiety.
anxiety, and even they're even doing trials with social autism.
Oh,
To
really?
help people deal with their, to help people interact better with others, who have, who are on the spectrum. And I mean, I'll give you a personal example of,
Yeah, I'd love that. Go ahead.
And really, this was a foundational experience that I had that made me think that, these psychedelic experiences were valuable, not only short term, but long term. I was in college and I did mushrooms, and I was having this I was clearly, tripping. And I started thinking about all these things I was anxious about in my life. And they began to sort of feel like a physical weight on me. Like I just kept going through this loop in my mind where I'd be worried about this. And, I realized, they were really dominating me and making me feel terrible much of the time. And then I suddenly visualized them all as like I was like this boulder weighing me down. And then I suddenly realized, wait a second, I'm holding the boulder. And that's why and all I have to do is let it go, and that weight will drop away. And I had that experience of letting this go, and suddenly I didn't have any worries anymore. It was magical. And that was something, I still, after that, I still got anxious about things, but I always remember that basically I'm holding this to myself. I'm feeling anxious because I want to feel anxious on some level. And all I have to do is let it go, and things change. And so and it's sort of like a muscle that you can develop. So you don't need the drugs to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Once you have that experience and you see it and you feel the success of it, then you can just learn to keep doing it. And I use that insight to this day, 50 years later. And it's so that's like the kind of experience that the people in these clinical trials talk about as well.
Yeah, that's incredible. So the way I actually found out about psychedelics, because my entire life I not a drinker, I'm a one drink person. I'd never tried marijuana, I'd never tried any type of drug at all. But I was dating this guy, and he had served in the Iraqi war, and he had PTSD, and he saw that there were going to be two veterans who were speaking at a college, and he got invited to go. He didn't even know what he was walking into. And it turned out that these two veterans had both used ayahuasca. It was a husband and wife. They had both also served in the Iraqi war, and they were telling their story that the wife had taken one session with a shaman in a very, protected, safe environment. Again, setting and who you're doing this with is so important. This is not for recreational. This is definitely for spiritual growth and transformation. And she had one session and was completely relieved of all of her PTSD symptoms. So her husband had to have a couple of sessions, but again, which is DMT, the active ingredient in ayahuasca, they were able to release that. And so he decided he was going to seek this out and find a shaman in our area to go and do this with. And he did. And he had this incredible experience where he saw himself in this scene that he was very aware of in Iraq, where there was a truck that had gotten bombed. And while it had gotten bombed, the enemy inside were trying to escape, and they had been just completely charred in their place. And he said that he didn't realize it until he was in this state of ayahuasca, that when that happened, he shut off his ability to smell because he couldn't tolerate the way that that was. And he had been carrying it like this forward for the next 20 years. And they showed him that this was something that he could release. He didn't need to protect that anymore. And so he released that, and he was just amazed afterwards of how his sense of smell had been restored, how he had shut that off. And again, he worked with this many times and started to work through his PTSD. And that's how I became curious and started doing the research for it. So I want to share a couple of statistics in your book that you wrote about. Now, these are a little bit old because then I didn't look up what they are right now, but this is from 2014 when you wrote this book, so almost 10 years ago. But you said that the VA had an annual budget for treating PTSD that increased from $40 billion to $140 billion. And the veterans' PTSD compensation had grown to $200,000. And that would require PTSD related payments at a cost of $4.3 billion. So this is almost 10 years ago. You updated and wrote something in 2022 in the beginning, in the forward of your book, in this new edition. And in there it said that PTSD had reached $1.3 million in 2012, and an average of 22 veterans were committing suicide every day. So obviously, especially within the VA, this has become an epidemic. I've seen it personally with people that I've known who have served. And I just want people to know that there's help that's coming in the form of these really well-designed, double-blinded, placebo studies with statistical significance showing that they can help alleviate these symptoms. And hopefully that helps these people to want to stay here and want to live and want to not just live, but to enjoy their lives.
Yeah. And, I think I wrote in the book, a lot of the early clinical subjects were women who had PTSD from being raped. And it was something like 50% of women who experience rape end up having PTSD as a result. And, and so as you said, this guy who had this experience, who was smelling this burning flesh, shut off his smell. Women who are raped often shut off their all physical sensations. So they report, they say they feel like they have no connection to their body, like their body is this alien thing that they can't feel really. And I'm sure that they're shut off all their feelings, both emotional and physical, to avoid the pain. And that, so when they have these experiences, suddenly they can feel themselves again, because they get over the fear and they get back to like I said, the emergency alarm, the fire alarms that's going off in the basement, and they get to finally open that locked door and look inside. And Nick, the Marine who's in my book, actually had a remarkably similar experience to the guy that you said, where, he saw the truck in the convoy he was in get hit by an IED, and he saw his friends burn alive in the front of that truck.
Wow.
And he just couldn't get on. And not only that, but he also had experiences where, there are these like 12-year-olds, Iraqi kids with automatic weapons firing at him. And so he's up at his 50 caliber machine gun and mows them down. But meanwhile, he feels like he's a killer of children. And when he had his MDMA experience, one of his MDMA experiences, again, he goes down to that basement that he's afraid of, and he looks inside, and there's this monster in this cage. And he suddenly starts feeling this, first he feels this revulsion for the monster. And then he starts feeling the sympathy for this monster locked in the cage. And he opens the door and realizes that the monster is him. and then he embraces himself, so he felt he was a monster, and that's what he was living with. And this allowed him to realize, and the therapist who was working with him on this, would say, when he was saying, I did these horrible things, the therapist would say, well, you were in a war. You were protecting your friends. You were doing what you were supposed to be doing, what your duty was.
Yeah.
So it's very, it's all very moving, all this stuff. And the potential, I just wish that this had been in wide use 15 years ago, because I can't tell you how many people have contacted me saying, I have this horrible problem, where can I do this therapy? And there has been an underground therapy, but
sure,
that's tricky, but very soon this is going to be mainstreamed, and nobody's ever going to walk down to the local pharmacy and fulfill their subscription for MDMA or psilocybin or whatever. The way it will work is you'll get a referral to a clinic where you can go and have these treatment experiences.
Yeah.
And
well,
right now,
I want everybody who's listening, if you have somebody that who's studying or who's suffering from PTSD, I would highly encourage giving them your book, Acid Test, so they can read about this, because I feel that there's so much fear that was put upon psychedelics, where unless you're educated, I mean, before I ever experienced this myself, I spent a lot of time reading and researching and trying to decide, was this going to be safe? I didn't want to do something that was going to put my brain in jeopardy. And they have been showing over and over again that not only is this safe, but it's healing. And I'm so excited that probably, to your point, within the next 2 years, there will be a legal solution for people who are suffering, where they're not going to have to just drown themselves with antidepressants. I was a pharmaceutical sales rep for Pfizer for 7 years, and I know a lot about these antidepressants and what they do and what they turn off in you and make people feel completely alien to who they are, as if they weren't already feeling alien from who they were with the depression and the PTSD to begin with.
That's so important, is that the drugs that they now use to treat psychiatric conditions often make things worse.
Right.
And in fact, even right now, it's legal. There are places where you can do ketamine and have therapy, the therapeutic experience with the ketamine, which is a different kind of psychedelic. And it might not be as, in my opinion, it's not probably as effective as psilocybin or ecstasy would be in a therapeutic situation. But I think that they're getting good results. And it's also used to treat depression.
Yes.
And had some, documented success with that. So the possibilities are already beginning, and they're only going to expand tremendously over the next 10 years.
Yeah, and many states have already begun the process of decriminalizing, which puts the persecution of this on the lowest level. So states like Colorado have already decriminalized psilocybin. Oregon, I think, actually made it legal for a lot of the psychedelic substance to be used. Washington, I think, is a similar. There's a decriminalization, I know, for a lot of the psychedelics in California. So I think eventually we'll get to the point where they at least won't be, people won't be afraid to try to use them because they.
And also, there's also the issue is that of cost. And insurance companies need to begin to cover it. They need to sort of settle on a whole cost structure, which is complicated.
Right.
And then I think that a lot of people involved in this, it's very important that there be some kind of financial aid, so that this is not a drug and a therapy that's only restricted to people who have a lot of money.
Yes.
And that sometimes what happens is that people who can afford it are charged money not only for their own therapy, but to also pay for therapy of people who can't afford it. I mean, it's not explicitly that, but that's kind of the way it works.
Right. Well, I want to thank you so much for the way that you wrote this book. It was done in such a beautiful way. I didn't know what to expect when I picked up your book. I just knew what the premise was, but the way that you wrote about it, I thought was absolutely fascinating. You started with the journey of the discovery of LSD, and you did each chapter as a story that focused on one aspect. So maybe it was the veteran who had the PTSD issues. Maybe it was the lady who had been raped and her journey with MDMA. And then you focused on the folks like Doblin, who is, trying to go through and get approvals to do these clinical trials, and other people like Michael and his wife who were trying to do the trials. And
That
I
would
was
be
riveted.
Mithoefer you're talking about,
Yes,
who
yes.
was the psychiatrist who did the early study, the clinical studies, and who is, these are amazing people.
Oh my goodness.
All of them are just, I'm so grateful to know them, and I tried to convey I didn't want to just talk at people in the book. I wanted them to experience this, to get to know who these people were and how they thought, and also to experience what it was like, with the Marine, Nick. I wanted people to understand how, what kind of injury would create this condition, and what the experience of having PTSD was like. And
you did. You were very successful. Your ability to write, Tom, and to describe things pulls you in and makes you feel like you're living it along with them. I mean, you are such an amazing writer. By the way, Tom is not only just a journalist, but he's a Pulitzer award-winning journalist, and that says an awful lot about his writing.
Well, thanks so much, Laurie. I appreciate it, and thank you for having me once again on your show.
Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for, I can't imagine how much work you put into a book like this, the research, the talking to each and individual person that was involved in this. And I think you're doing so much good in just bringing light to this and taking the fear away from a treatment that is just on the cusp of being more mainstream now.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.